The scream tore through the forest before Alara even reached the border stones. She stopped running, only when her lungs refused to take another step, gasping against a tree that smelled of pine and smoke. Behind her, far off now, torches still burned where her old pack had chased her out. She pressed a hand to her ribs, feeling the ache where a rock had struck her hours ago, and forced herself to keep moving. The moon was high, and the woods around her belonged to no pack she knew. That was either the safest place in the world or the most dangerous. She had heard of this land before, in hushed voices back home. Territory of the Alpha King, they called it. The strongest wolf ever born, a man whose growl could silence a room, and whose mercy was said to be rarer than his anger. Nobody crossed into his territory without permission. Alara had no permission. She had nothing at all, except the clothes on her back, and a body that refused, no matter how hard she tried, to shift into her wolf. That single failure had cost her everything. An Omega who could not shift was not just weak. She was cursed, according to the elders of her old pack, a danger to bloodlines, a shame to be erased quietly before others noticed. She had known for years that her time was coming, ever since her 13th birthday passed without the change ever taking hold in her body. She had prayed, trained, starved herself thin trying to force it, and none of it had worked. Tonight, when the pack finally decided she had failed enough tests, they came for her with torches instead of comfort. She did not know why they let her run, instead of finishing what they started. Maybe out of some last shred of decency. Maybe because chasing a curse across a border into another Alpha's land was more trouble than they wanted. Either way, she was here now, deep inside King Kain's territory, with nowhere else to go. The border stones loomed ahead like old teeth jutting from the earth, marked with claw symbols that glowed faintly under moonlight. Crossing them without an invitation was considered an act of war in some territories. Alara did not care anymore. If death waited for her here, at least it would not be by the hands of people who once called her family. She stepped over the stones. Nothing happened. No horn sounded. No wolves descended from the trees to tear her apart. Just silence, and the distant call of an owl somewhere above. She let out a shaking breath and kept walking, deeper into land that did not belong to her, following the smell of wood smoke, because it was the only thing that felt like safety in a night full of danger. By the time she found the outer edge of the pack town, dawn was still hours away. Small wooden houses stood dark and quiet, smoke curling faintly from a few chimneys. She kept to the shadows, moving like something that had learned long ago how to disappear. It was a skill she had perfected over years of being unwanted. Being invisible had kept her alive more than once. She found the stables by their smell before she saw them. Warm hay and animal musk drifting on the night air. A long wooden building stood near the edge of the settlement, set apart from the grander houses, its walls patched and worn compared to the polished stone of what she guessed was the castle in the distance. This was not where healthy, prized wolves would be kept. This was somewhere quieter. Somewhere for wolves nobody wanted to look at too closely. Which meant it was exactly the kind of place a girl like her belonged. She slipped through a gap in the wooden fence and pushed open a side door that hung slightly loose on its hinges. Inside, the air was warmer, thick with the smell of medicine and sickness. Straw covered the floor. Along both walls, in wide wooden pens, lay wolves in various states of suffering. Some were thin, ribs showing beneath patchy fur. Others had wounds wrapped in cloth, whimpering softly in their sleep. One large gray wolf near the back lifted its head weakly as she entered, sniffed the air, then let its head fall back down, too exhausted to care about a stranger. Alara felt something in her chest loosen for the first time in hours. These wolves would not judge her for being unable to shift. They would not chase her with torches or call her cursed. They were simply sick, simply suffering, in the same way she had suffered for years without anyone noticing. She understood them instantly, the way only someone broken can understand something else that is broken. She found an empty corner near a young wolf pup who lay shivering despite the warmth of the stable, its breathing shallow and uneven. Without thinking twice, she knelt beside it, running gentle fingers along its side, checking for wounds the way she had learned from watching her grandmother tend to sick animals long before her own exile. The pup's fever burned hot beneath her palm. "You are not going anywhere tonight," she whispered, more to herself than to the pup. "Not while I am here." She found a bucket near the entrance, filled with clean water, and tore a strip of cloth from the hem of her already ruined dress, soaking it before pressing it gently to the pup's forehead. The animal whimpered, but did not pull away. Something about her touch seemed to calm it, and slowly its breathing began to even out. Alara stayed like that for hours, moving between the sickest wolves, checking wounds, offering water, humming softly under her breath the way she used to when she was younger, and had not yet learned that gentleness could be seen as weakness. She found herbs growing wild just outside the stable door, plants she recognized from her grandmother's teachings, crushing them into a paste for a wolf with an infected paw. She had no idea if this pack used such remedies, or if she was breaking some unspoken rule by touching wolves that belonged to a king she had never met. She was too tired to care. By the time gray light began creeping through the cracks in the stable walls, she had fallen asleep sitting upright against a wooden post, one hand still resting on the recovering pup beside her. She did not hear the door open. She did not hear the heavy, deliberate footsteps of a man who checked on his weakest wolves every single morning before the rest of his pack even stirred, a habit few people knew about and fewer still understood. The Alpha King Cain ruled with a strength that made rival packs tremble at the mention of his name, yet every dawn, before his crown of leadership settled back onto his shoulders, he came here, to the sick and the forgotten, because he remembered what it felt like to almost not survive. He stopped in the doorway. A stranger sat among his sick wolves, sleeping upright with dried blood on her sleeve and dirt smudged across her cheek. The pup beside her, one he had feared would not make it through the night, slept peacefully, with its breathing steady, for the first time in days. Cain's sharp eyes moved slowly over the stable, taking in the freshly changed water buckets, the crushed herbs on a nearby ledge, the careful wrapping on another wolf's paw that had not been there the evening before. Someone had spent the entire night caring for his wolves. A stranger, uninvited, unnamed, had done more in one night than half his healers managed in a week. He should have been furious, an unknown outsider inside his territory, inside his stables, close enough to his most vulnerable pack members to do real harm if she wished. Every instinct trained into him since childhood told him to wake her with a growl, to demand answers, to treat her presence as the threat it should have been. Instead, he found himself simply watching her. She looked young, perhaps his age or slightly younger, though exhaustion and worry had carved lines into her face that did not belong there. Her clothes were torn in places, her boots worn through at the toe, and there was a healing bruise along her jaw that made his jaw tighten with an anger he did not fully understand yet. Whoever she was, wherever she had come from, she had clearly run from something terrible, to end up sleeping among sick wolves in a stranger's land. The pup stirred, nuzzling closer into her side, and she shifted slightly in her sleep, murmuring something too soft to hear. Cain stood there longer than he intended to, arms crossed, studying a woman who had no idea her entire fate now rested in the decision of the very man watching her sleep. He could have her removed. He could have her questioned, imprisoned, sent away, or worse, depending on what threat she posed. Kings before him would have done exactly that without a second thought. But the pup was breathing easier than it had in days, and the wolf with the infected paw had stopped whimpering in pain, and something about the quiet, careful way she had arranged herself among his sickest wolves, close enough to hear if any of them cried out in the night, told him this was not the presence of an enemy. He turned and walked back out into the pale morning light without waking her, already knowing he would return tomorrow to see if she was still there. She was not gone by midday, when the stable hand named Oliver finally noticed her curled in the corner and let out a startled shout that had her jolting upright, heart hammering, hands raised, as though bracing for a blow. Oliver, a broad-shouldered young man with kind eyes and a nervous laugh, took a step back at her reaction, clearly more surprised than threatening. "Easy," he said quickly. "Easy. I am not going to hurt you. Who are you? How did you get in here?" Alara scrambled to her feet, putting distance between herself and the stranger, eyes darting toward the door, as old instincts screamed at her to run. But the wolves around her, the ones she had spent the night caring for, remained calm, some even lifting their heads toward her with something like recognition rather than fear. "I did not mean to trespass," she said, voice rough from disuse and exhaustion. "I only needed somewhere to rest. I will leave now." Oliver's eyes moved past her to the pup, now sitting up and alert for the first time in nearly a week, its fever visibly broken. His mouth fell open slightly. "That pup has been dying for days," he murmured. "The healers said it would not last the week. It had a fever from infection, not from illness that could not be treated," Elara said before she could stop herself. Old habits of explanation kicking in despite her fear. "I cleaned the wound properly and used herbs to bring the fever down. It should recover fully now, with rest." Oliver stared at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his expression, before he finally spoke again, quieter this time. "You should not be here. This is the king's stable. If anyone finds an outsider among his sick wolves, there will be questions, dangerous ones." "Then I will go," Elara said quickly, already moving toward the door, bracing herself for another night without shelter, another day of hunger and running, with nowhere left to run to. "Wait," Oliver said, something in his voice stopping her mid-step. He glanced around the stable, taking in the improvement in nearly every animal she had touched overnight, and something like calculation crossed his young face. "Where would you even go? You look like you have not eaten in days." Elara said nothing, which was answer enough. Oliver rubbed the back of his neck, clearly torn between the rules he knew and the evidence in front of him. "The stables need help," he finally said. "More help than I can give alone, especially with the sick ones. If you know what you are doing, and it certainly looks like you do, maybe there is a way to explain your presence that does not end with you thrown out, or worse." Hope, fragile and unfamiliar, flickered somewhere in Elara's chest. "You would help me? You do not even know my name." "Elara," she said quietly, testing whether saying her true name here felt as dangerous as it had back home. It did not. "My name is Elara." Oliver nodded slowly. "I am Oliver. I look after these wolves, though clearly not as well as you managed in a single night." He glanced toward the pup again, shaking his head slightly in disbelief. "I cannot promise the king will allow you to stay, but I can speak to the head healer. Tell her we found someone skilled who wandered in seeking shelter." It is not exactly a lie. It was, in fact, a considerable stretch of the truth, but Elara was too desperate for a place to belong to argue the details. She nodded, gratitude tightening her throat until she could barely speak. What neither of them knew, as they stood among the recovering wolves discussing her uncertain future, was that the Alpha King had already decided her fate the moment he saw the pup sleeping peacefully beside her. He simply had not told anyone yet, including himself, exactly why that decision felt so important. Word of a stranger inside the sick stables reached the head healer, a sharp-eyed woman named Nora, before the sun had fully climbed above the trees. She arrived with her arms crossed and suspicion written plainly across her face, ready to have the intruder removed on sight. What she found instead stopped her at the doorway. 6 wolves that had been suffering for days, some for weeks, showed clear signs of improvement overnight. The pup she had personally given up hope for sat awake and alert, tail thumping weakly against the straw. A young woman stood nervously near the back wall, hands twisted together, waiting for judgment. Nora walked the length of the stable in silence, checking each animal herself, pressing fingers to necks and paws, murmuring quiet observations under her breath. When she finally turned to face Elara, her expression had shifted from suspicion into something closer to curiosity. "Who taught you to treat infection like this?" she asked, gesturing toward the wolf with the healing paw. "My grandmother," Elara answered honestly. "She cared for sick animals in our village. I learned by watching her, then by doing it myself, when she grew too old to manage alone." "And where is this village of yours?" Elara hesitated, old fear rising in her throat. "Far from here. I do not wish to return." Nora studied her for a long moment, clearly reading far more into that answer than the words themselves offered. Whatever she saw in Elara's face, exhaustion, old bruises, the particular kind of fear that came from being hunted by one's own family, seemed to satisfy whatever question she had been silently asking. "The king does not tolerate strangers wandering his territory without explanation," Nora said finally. "But he also values results more than most leaders I have served. If you can prove your skill was no accident, there may be a place for you here. Temporarily, at least, until we understand who you are and where you came from." It was not a warm welcome, but it was more than Elara had dared hope for only hours earlier. She nodded quickly. gratitude threatening to spill over into tears she refused to let fall in front of strangers. "I will not disappoint you," she said. Nora's expression softened only slightly. "See that you do not. And stay away from the main grounds until I have spoken properly with the king about your presence. Some things are easier explained, after they are already working in our favor." For the next several days, Elara threw herself into the work, with a desperation born from having nowhere else to go. She rose before dawn each morning, checking on every animal in the stable, changing bandages, preparing herbal treatments from plants she gathered at the forest edge, and staying long into the night whenever a wolf's condition worsened. Oliver worked alongside her, teaching her the routines of the pack's medical practices while she taught him remedies passed down through generations of women in her old village. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that every single morning, just before dawn broke fully over the horizon, the Alpha King returned to watch her work from a distance, careful never to be seen. He told himself it was simple oversight, the responsible checking in of a leader, ensuring his weakest pack members received proper care. He told himself the same thing on the second morning, and the third, even as the explanation grew thinner with each passing day. By the fifth morning, he had stopped pretending the visits were about the wolves at all. She moved through the stable like someone who had spent her entire life caring for creatures too broken or too forgotten for anyone else to bother with. There was a tenderness in the way she handled even the most aggressive, pain-driven animals, a patience that calmed even wolves who had snapped at every healer who came near them before her arrival. Cain found himself studying not just her methods, but her, the small furrow of concentration between her brows, the way she hummed softly under her breath while working, the exhaustion she clearly tried to hide from everyone around her. On the sixth morning, she nearly caught him. He had lingered too long near the stable entrance, watching as she coaxed a particularly stubborn old wolf into taking medicine hidden inside a piece of meat, when she suddenly turned toward the door as though sensing his presence. Cain stepped back into the shadow of a nearby tree just in time, heart pounding in a way that startled him more than any battle ever had. He was the Alpha King. He did not hide from anyone, let alone a stranger with no pack and no name known to his court. Yet there he stood, pressed against rough bark like a boy caught doing something forbidden, waiting until her attention returned to the wolves, before he allowed himself to breathe again. That evening, he summoned Nora to his private chambers, his expression carefully neutral, as he asked about the progress of the sick wolves under her care. Nora, sharp as ever, gave her report with obvious satisfaction, praising the unexpected skill of the outsider who had wandered into their territory nearly a week earlier. "She has saved 4 wolves. I genuinely believed we would lose," Nora admitted. "Her methods are unconventional in some ways, but undeniably effective. I would like your permission to formally offer her a position within the healing staff, assuming her background does not present any concerns." Cain considered this for a long moment, aware that his answer mattered far more than Nora could possibly understand. Has she given any indication of where she came from? Any enemies who might come looking for her? None that she has shared. She is guarded about her past, though I suspect it involves more pain than she lets on. There is old cruelty in the way she flinches sometimes, my king, the kind that comes from family, not strangers. Something dark and protective coiled tight in Cain's chest at those words, an instinct he did not fully understand, but could not ignore either. "Grant her the position," he said finally, "on the condition that she is treated fairly and given whatever she requires to continue her work. If her past catches up to her, I want to know immediately." Nora raised an eyebrow slightly at the intensity behind his instruction, but said nothing further, simply nodding before taking her leave. Elara learned of her official position the following morning, delivered through Nora with the same brisk efficiency she brought to everything else. She stood frozen for a moment, disbelief washing over her as the healer explained that she now had a place within the pack, however small, however conditional. "You will still sleep in the stables for now," Nora said, "given the sensitive nature of your unknown history, but you will receive proper meals, a small wage, and the respect due to someone who has clearly dedicated their life to this work. Do you accept these terms?" "Yes," Elara breathed, hardly daring to believe it. "Yes, of course." For the first time since the night she fled her old pack, something that felt dangerously close to hope began to take root inside her chest. She had no idea that the king himself had personally approved her position, No idea that he had been watching her every single morning since her arrival. No idea that the careful distance he kept was not indifference, but something far more complicated stirring beneath the surface of a man who had never allowed himself to want anything simply for himself. She only knew that for the first time in longer than she could remember, she had somewhere to belong, even if that place was a stable full of sick wolves, and secrets neither of them had spoken aloud yet. Weeks passed, and Alara settled into a rhythm she had not dared to imagine possible only a month earlier. She woke before dawn, moved through the stables checking on every animal by name, and worked until her hands ached and her back protested every movement. It was hard work, thankless in the eyes of most of the pack who still viewed the stable staff as beneath their notice, but for Alara, it felt like breathing after years of holding her breath. The wolves trusted her in a way that seemed to surprise even Nora. A wolf named Bramble, an old scarred fighter who had bitten 2 previous healers, allowed Alara to change his bandages without so much as a growl. A litter of pups born too early and too weak to survive on their own thrived under her constant attention, growing stronger each week until their mother finally relaxed enough to let Alara handle them without hovering anxiously nearby. What Alara did not expect, what she could not have prepared herself for, was how often she found herself thinking about the king she had still never officially met. She knew his name, of course. Everyone in the territory spoke of Alpha King Cain with a mixture of respect and quiet fear, describing a leader who had taken his throne young after tragedy struck his family, who had built the pack into one of the strongest in the region through sheer discipline and unrelenting strength. Some described him as cold, distant, more comfortable with strategy and battle than with the softer parts of leadership. Others spoke in hushed, almost reverent tones of small kindnesses he showed when no one expected them, quiet gestures toward the weakest members of his pack that contradicted the fearsome reputation preceding him. Alara had begun to notice small things herself, things she could not quite explain. New medical supplies would appear in the stable storeroom exactly when needed, before she had even mentioned running low. Extra blankets arrived during a particularly cold week, without anyone claiming responsibility for sending them. Once, she found a rare healing herb she had been searching for weeks, left neatly beside the storeroom door, one that did not grow naturally anywhere near the territory. She mentioned it to Oliver one afternoon, while they worked together mending a torn section of fence. "Someone keeps leaving things for the stable," she said, trying to sound casual despite the curiosity gnawing at her. "Supplies, herbs, things I never requested through official channels. Do you know who might be responsible?" Oliver's mouth twitched into something that looked suspiciously like a knowing smile, though he quickly hid it. Probably just Nora being generous when she thinks no one is watching. She likes to pretend she is tougher than she actually is. Alara did not fully believe him, but she let the subject drop, too grateful for the mysterious kindness to question it too deeply. The truth, though neither of them knew it yet, was far more complicated than a generous healer's quiet charity. Cain had continued his early morning visits long after any reasonable justification for doing so had expired. He told himself each time that this would be the last visit, that a king with a territory to protect and difficult neighboring alliances to manage had no business spending his mornings watching a stable healer work. And each morning, he found himself there anyway, drawn by something he refused to name, even in the privacy of his own thoughts. He had learned things about her simply through careful observation, the way she favored her left side slightly when lifting heavy buckets, evidence of an old injury never properly healed, the way she flinched, just barely, whenever someone raised their voice unexpectedly nearby, even in laughter. The careful, deliberate way she avoided any mention of family or home when others asked polite questions about her past. Every detail painted a picture of someone who had survived something far worse than simple hardship, and every detail made the protective instinct coiling in Cain's chest grow sharper and more insistent. He had not intended to become personally involved in ensuring her comfort. It had started small, a request to the supply master to ensure the stable staff received adequate medical materials, nothing that would draw attention or suspicion. But small requests had grown into deliberate actions, extra blankets sent during cold weather, rare herbs acquired through trade routes specifically because he remembered overhearing her mention needing them, all delivered anonymously through channels that kept his involvement carefully hidden. He knew, on some level, that this behavior bordered on obsession rather than simple concern. Alpha Kings did not personally arrange supply deliveries for stable workers they had never officially spoken to. They did not memorize the small details of a healer's daily routine, or feel their chest tighten with something dangerously close to longing every time they watched her laugh softly at some joke Oliver made. But knowing something was foolish had never stopped Kane from doing it anyway when it came to Alara. The turning point came on a morning when everything nearly fell apart. A messenger arrived at dawn carrying urgent news of unrest along the northern border, requiring Kane's immediate attention and departure for several days to manage negotiations that could mean the difference between peace and costly conflict with a neighboring territory. He should have left immediately, every instinct honed by years of leadership screaming at him to prioritize his pack's safety above all else. Instead, he found himself walking toward the stables one final time before his departure, telling himself it was simply prudent to ensure everything remained in order during his absence. He found Alara already awake, kneeling beside a wolf that had taken a turn for the worse overnight, her hands moving with practiced precision as she worked to stabilize the animal's breathing. Sweat beaded along her hairline despite the early morning chill, and exhaustion had carved deep shadows beneath her eyes, evidence of a night spent entirely without rest. He should have announced his presence properly, should have maintained the careful distance he had kept for weeks. Instead, before he fully understood his own intentions, he found himself stepping into the stable and kneeling beside her, reaching for supplies she needed before she even had to ask. Alara startled so badly she nearly dropped the cloth in her hands, spinning to face him with wide, panicked eyes, before recognition dawned and her expression shifted into something far more complicated. Surprise mixed with wariness, mixed with something else entirely, that neither of them was prepared to examine too closely. "My king," she breathed, immediately trying to rise and offer the proper respect his position demanded, though exhaustion made the movement clumsy. "Stay," Kane said, his voice rougher than intended. "The wolf needs your attention more than formality does right now." She hesitated only a moment before returning her focus to the struggling animal, though Kane noticed her hands trembled slightly now. Whether from exhaustion or his unexpected presence he could not say. Together, without further words, they worked to stabilize the wolf's breathing, Kane holding the animal steady, while Alara administered the herbal treatment she had prepared. It took nearly an hour before the wolf's breathing finally evened out into something resembling normal rest. By then, the sun had fully risen, and Kane knew he had already delayed his departure longer than any border crisis should reasonably allow. "Thank you," Alara said quietly, finally meeting his eyes directly for the first time since his arrival in the stable weeks earlier. "I did not expect the king himself to assist with such work. I check on all my sick wolves personally," Kane said, the explanation feeling thinner and more transparent than it ever had before, especially now that they were finally face to face, rather than hidden behind the safety of distance. It seemed only right to help when needed. Something in the way she looked at him then, searching and curious in equal measure, told him she did not entirely believe the explanation, though she was too respectful of his position to challenge it directly. "I hope your journey north goes well," she said instead, surprising him with the knowledge that she was aware of his impending departure at all. "The wolves and I will manage well enough in your absence." Kane rose slowly, forcing himself to put necessary distance between them, despite every instinct urging him to remain exactly where he was. "I am certain you will. You have proven more capable than most healers this territory has ever known." He left, before either of them could say anything further, before the strange tension building steadily between them could grow into something neither was prepared to name. But as he rode north that morning, negotiations and border disputes weighing heavily on his mind, he found his thoughts returning again and again to the exhausted, determined healer working tirelessly among his sickest wolves, and to the terrifying realization that his feelings toward her had grown into something far more dangerous than simple concern for a valued member of his pack. He was the Alpha King, bound by duty to consider alliances, bloodlines, and the strategic needs of his territory above all personal desire. A stable healer with no known family, no pack of her own, and a past shrouded in secrets was, by every practical measure, an impossible match. Yet somewhere between watching her save a dying pup on her very first night in his territory and holding a struggling wolf steady beside her only hours earlier, Kane had stopped caring about what was practical. News traveled fast within a pack, faster still within a pack, as tightly bound as Kane's territory, and it did not take long for word of the king's unusual visit to the stables to spread among the staff, and eventually to the wider community. By the time Kane returned from his week-long negotiations along the northern border, whispers had already begun weaving themselves through every corner of the settlement. Some of the whispers were harmless curiosity, wondering aloud what could possibly draw their king's personal attention to a lowly stable healer. Others carried a sharper edge, suspicion dressed up as concern, questioning why an outsider with no known family or pack history had been granted such unusual favor so quickly after her arrival. Elara felt the shift in how people looked at her almost immediately, where before she had simply been ignored, invisible in the way she had always preferred. Now she found herself the subject of pointed stares and hushed conversations that stopped abruptly whenever she walked past. A group of younger pack members, sons and daughters of respected families within the territory, took particular delight in making their disdain known. "I heard she cannot even shift," one girl named Ivy whispered loudly enough for Elara to hear, as she passed near the market square one afternoon, gathering supplies for the stable. "What kind of wolf cannot shift? There must be something deeply wrong with her." Elara kept her head down and continued walking, old wounds reopening at words she had hoped to leave behind forever when she crossed into this territory. She had been careful, so careful, to avoid any situation that might reveal her inability to shift, knowing exactly how such information could destroy the fragile safety she had built for herself here. She had not told anyone, not Oliver, not Nora, not a single soul within Kane's pack, about the curse that had gotten her exiled from her birth pack. As far as anyone here knew, she was simply a skilled healer who had wandered into their territory, seeking work and shelter, her past left deliberately vague. If the truth ever surfaced, she feared it would undo everything she had managed to build, however small and fragile that foundation still remained. That evening, exhausted from both physical labor and the emotional weight of overheard cruelty, Elara sat alone in the stable, long after the other staff had retired for the night, running gentle fingers along the fur of a sleeping wolf, while silent tears finally slipped free. She did not hear the door open, too lost in her own thoughts to notice Kane's return, until his shadow fell across the straw beside her. "You are crying," he said simply, no judgment in his tone, only quiet concern that startled her into quickly wiping her face with the back of her hand. "It is nothing, my king," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice despite the tightness still lingering in her throat. "Simply tired from a long day." Kane settled onto an overturned crate nearby, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him despite the evening chill, but respectful enough of the distance that had grown increasingly difficult to maintain between them. "I have heard some of what is being said about you," he admitted after a long moment of silence. The whispers among the younger pack members. Elara's shoulders tensed visibly. "It is nothing I cannot handle." "You should not have to handle it alone," Kane said, an edge of quiet steel entering his voice that made Elara glance up in surprise. "Cruelty has no place among my people, regardless of who it targets. They are simply curious," Elara said carefully, unwilling to reveal just how deeply the words had cut, unwilling to give voice to the fear that curiosity would eventually uncover truths she desperately needed to keep buried. "It is understandable. I am an outsider here, with no family name to explain my presence." Kane studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful and searching in his gaze that made her want to look away and lean closer all at once. "You do not have to explain your past to me," he said finally. "Not unless you wish to, but know that whatever brought you here, whatever you are running from, you have earned your place in this pack, through your own skill and dedication. That is worth more than any family name." The kindness in his words nearly undid her completely. She had spent so many years believing herself fundamentally broken, fundamentally unworthy of belonging anywhere, that hearing someone as powerful and respected as Kane speak otherwise felt almost impossible to accept. "Thank you," she whispered, unable to find any words adequate enough to express what his simple acknowledgement meant to her. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, the only sounds the soft breathing of sleeping wolves and the distant call of night birds outside. Elara found herself sneaking glances at Kane's profile in the dim lantern light, taking in the sharp lines of his jaw, the quiet intensity that seemed to radiate from him even in stillness, and wondering, not for the first time, why a king with every advantage in the world would choose to spend his evenings sitting on an overturned crate in a stable full of sick animals, rather than enjoying the comforts his position afforded him. "Why do you come here?" she finally asked, curiosity overcoming caution. "Every morning. And now this evening as well. Surely a king has more pressing responsibilities than checking on sick wolves personally." Cain was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing how much truth to offer in response. "When I was young," he said finally, "before I became alpha, I nearly died from an illness, much like the ones these wolves suffer from now. My family believed I would not survive. The only reason I did was because someone cared enough to sit with me through the worst of it, refusing to give up even when everyone else already had." Alara's breath caught slightly at the vulnerability in his admission, so different from the fearsome reputation others described when speaking of their king. "I never forgot what that kindness meant," Cain continued, his voice growing quieter still. "So I make it a point to ensure my weakest pack members, wolf or otherwise, never face their suffering entirely alone. It is a small thing, perhaps, but it matters to me." "It is not a small thing," Alara said softly. "It is the reason half these wolves are still alive today. Your presence, your insistence that they matter enough to be checked on personally, that shapes how your entire pack treats its most vulnerable members. I have seen the difference it makes." Something shifted in Cain's expression at her words, something warm and unguarded that he rarely allowed himself to show anyone. "You understand that better than most," he said. "Perhaps better than anyone I have known." The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither was quite ready to name, before Cain finally rose, clearing his throat and putting careful distance back between them. "Rest well, Alara," he said, using her name aloud, for what she realized was the very first time. "The wolves will still need you tomorrow, and you cannot care for them properly if you do not care for yourself as well." He left before she could respond, before either of them had to confront exactly what had passed between them in that quiet stable, lit only by lantern light. But as Alara finally settled down to sleep that night, curled beside the same sleeping wolves who had become her closest companions in this strange new life, she found herself smiling for the first time in longer than she could remember, the cruel whispers of that afternoon suddenly feeling far less powerful against the memory of a king who had chosen, without hesitation, to sit beside her in her lowest moment, rather than leave her to face it alone. The sickness arrived without warning, the way the worst things always seem to. It began with a single wolf, a young fighter named Garrick who had returned from routine border patrol, showing signs of fatigue that everyone initially dismissed as simple exhaustion. Within 2 days, 3 more wolves from the same patrol group had fallen ill, with matching symptoms: high fever, labored breathing, and a weakness that left even the strongest fighters unable to stand without support. By the 4th day, panic had begun spreading through the pack as swiftly as the illness itself. Nora worked tirelessly alongside her small team of healers, but the sickness resisted every treatment they attempted, growing worse instead of better despite their best efforts. Word came that a similar illness had struck a neighboring territory months earlier, wiping out nearly a third of their fighting force before finally running its course. Alara threw herself into the crisis with an intensity that frightened even Oliver, who had grown accustomed to her dedication over the previous weeks. She barely slept, moving constantly between the increasing number of afflicted wolves, testing different combinations of herbs and remedies she remembered from her grandmother's teachings, desperately searching for anything that might slow the illness's relentless spread. Cain visited the stables now more openly than ever, any pretense of secrecy abandoned in the face of a crisis threatening the very heart of his pack's strength. He watched with growing concern as Alara pushed herself past every reasonable limit, dark circles deepening beneath her eyes with each passing day, her hands trembling slightly from exhaustion, even as she continued working without complaint. "You need rest," he told her on the 6th day of the crisis, finding her swaying slightly on her feet as she attempted to prepare yet another herbal treatment. "You cannot help anyone if you collapse from exhaustion." "There is no time to rest," Alara insisted, though her voice had grown weak and thin. "Garrick's fever broke slightly with the new mixture. I think we may finally be making progress, but I need to monitor him closely to be certain the improvement holds." Cain's jaw tightened with a mixture of admiration and fear he could not fully separate from each other. "At least eat something," he said, pressing a small portion of bread and cheese into her hands, refusing to let the matter drop until she had taken at least a few bites under his watchful eye. The improvement in Garrick's condition, however slight, proved to be the turning point Alara had been desperately searching for. Working through the night with Nora and the rest of the healing staff, she refined the herbal treatment further, discovering that a particular combination of ingredients, when administered early enough in the illness's progression, could significantly slow its advancement and eventually allow the body's own strength to overcome the infection entirely. Over the following days, wolf after wolf began showing signs of recovery. Fevers breaking, breathing steadying, strength slowly returning to bodies that had been ravaged by the mysterious illness. What could have devastated the pack's fighting force instead became a story of narrow, hard-won victory, one that spread through the territory, with Alara's name attached to nearly every retelling. But victory came at a steep personal cost. On the 10th day of the crisis, with the worst of the outbreak finally behind them, and only a handful of wolves still requiring careful monitoring, Alara finally allowed herself to sit down for the first time in what felt like days. She had intended only to rest her eyes for a moment, to gather enough strength to complete one final round of checks, before finally permitting herself proper sleep. She did not wake on her own. Oliver found her collapsed against the wall of the stable, unconscious among the very wolves she had spent nearly 2 weeks fighting to save, her body finally giving out under the weight of exhaustion she had refused to acknowledge for far too long. His panicked shout brought Cain running from the nearby training grounds faster than anyone had ever seen their king move outside of actual combat. Cain reached the stable within moments, dropping to his knees beside Alara's unconscious form, with a fear that clawed at his chest more fiercely than any battle ever had. Her skin felt clammy and cold, despite the warmth of the stable, her breathing shallow but steady, evidence that this was exhaustion rather than the illness itself, though the distinction did little to ease the terror gripping him. "Get Nora, now," he ordered, his voice carrying an urgency that sent Oliver sprinting from the stable without hesitation. Cain gathered Alara carefully into his arms, her small frame feeling far too light, far too fragile against the strength he had grown so accustomed to seeing in her determined work over the previous weeks. He carried her from the stable himself, ignoring the startled glances of pack members who witnessed their formidable Alpha King cradling an unconscious stable healer against his chest, with a tenderness few had ever seen him display toward anyone. He carried her not to the modest quarters she had been given near the stables, but directly to the castle itself, to a guest chamber, with proper bedding and warmth that far exceeded anything she had experienced since her arrival in his territory. Nora arrived quickly, conducting a thorough examination that confirmed what Cain had already suspected: complete physical exhaustion from days of relentless work, without adequate rest or food. "She will recover with proper rest," Nora assured him, though the healer's sharp eyes lingered curiously on the way Cain refused to leave Alara's bedside, even after receiving the reassurance he had been desperately seeking. But she pushed herself far past reasonable limits. Whatever drove her to work herself into such a state, it goes beyond simple dedication to her duties. Cain said nothing, unable to voice the tangled mixture of fear, admiration, and something far deeper than either, that had gripped him the moment he saw her collapsed, and vulnerable in a way he had never witnessed before. He remained beside her through the following hours as she slept, occasionally shifting restlessly but never fully waking, her body finally allowing itself the rest it had been denied for far too long. He studied her face in the soft afternoon light filtering through the chamber windows, noting details he had never had the opportunity to observe so closely before: the small scar above her eyebrow, the way her dark hair curled slightly at the temples, the peaceful stillness that had replaced the constant tension she carried whenever awake. When she finally stirred well into the evening, confusion clouding her expression as she took in unfamiliar surroundings far grander than anything she had known since arriving, Cain was there immediately, gently reassuring her before panic could fully take hold. "You are safe," he said softly, his hand finding hers without conscious thought. "You collapsed from exhaustion. Nora says you will recover fully, but you frightened everyone considerably." Alara blinked slowly, taking in her surroundings, the unfamiliar softness of proper bedding, the warmth of a chamber far removed from the stable she had grown accustomed to calling home. Realization dawned slowly. "This is the castle," she said weakly. "I should not be here. I need to return to the stables. The wolves still need monitoring." "The wolves are being cared for," Kane said firmly, gently pressing her back down as she attempted to rise. You saved this entire pack from a crisis that could have devastated us completely. You will remain here, resting properly, for as long as necessary. I do not belong in the castle, Elara whispered, old fears and insecurities creeping back into her voice, despite the exhaustion still weighing heavily on her body. Kane's grip on her hand tightened slightly, something fierce and certain entering his expression. You belong wherever I say you belong, he said, and right now, that is here, resting, until you have fully recovered. The quiet intensity in his words, combined with the tenderness in his gaze, left Elara with no argument sufficient to counter him, even if exhaustion had not already stolen most of her strength. She allowed herself to relax back into the unfamiliar softness of the bed, her hand still held gently within his, and for the first time since fleeing her old pack in terror weeks earlier, she allowed herself to believe, however cautiously, that perhaps she truly had found somewhere she belonged. Elara remained within the castle for 3 full days, as her strength slowly returned, and during that time, something between her and Kane shifted permanently, deepening into territory neither of them had fully intended to explore, but neither seemed able to resist either. Kane visited her chamber each morning and evening, ostensibly to check on her recovery, though their conversations quickly grew far beyond simple inquiries about her health. She learned about the weight of leadership he carried, the losses that had shaped him into the careful, guarded man he had become. He learned, slowly and through careful, patient questioning, fragments of her own painful history. I was never able to shift, she admitted quietly on the second evening, staring down at her hands rather than meeting his eyes, bracing herself for the disgust or disappointment she had grown to expect whenever this truth surfaced. My birth pack believed it made me cursed, dangerous somehow to the bloodline. They exiled me the night I arrived here, chased me from the only home I had ever known with torches and threats. She waited, breath held, for Kane's reaction, certain this confession would finally reveal the fundamental brokenness she had spent her entire life believing defined her. Instead, Kane reached for her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles across her knuckles, his expression holding nothing but quiet fury, directed entirely at the people who had hurt her, rather than at her herself. Your ability to shift has nothing to do with your worth, he said firmly. I have watched you save more lives with your bare hands and careful mind than most shifted wolves manage with all their strength combined. Whatever curse your old pack believed you carried, I see nothing here but extraordinary skill and courage. Tears welled in Elara's eyes at words she had never once expected to hear from anyone, let alone a king whose own strength and power were legendary throughout the region. You truly do not see me as cursed? I see someone the world failed to recognize the value of, Kane said, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show so openly. Their loss reshaped into the greatest gift my pack has ever received. The words settled into Elara's chest, like warmth spreading through ice that had frozen solid years ago, thawing something she had believed permanently broken beyond repair. She found herself leaning slightly toward him, drawn by a pull she no longer had the strength or desire to resist, and Kane mirrored the movement, their faces drawing closer in the soft lamplight of the quiet chamber. Neither moved to close the final distance, both aware of exactly what crossing that line would mean, the complications it would introduce into lives already carrying more than their fair share of difficulty. But the moment lingered, charged and undeniable, before Kane finally pulled back with visible reluctance, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead instead of her waiting lips. Rest, he murmured against her skin. There will be time for everything else once you have fully recovered. The promise implicit in his words left Elara's heart racing, long after he had departed for the evening. Hope and terror tangled together in equal measure, as she considered exactly what a future with the Alpha King himself might actually look like, and whether someone with her history and her broken nature could ever truly deserve such happiness. By the time she returned to the stables, fully recovered and eager to resume her duties, word of her extended stay within the castle had already spread through every corner of the pack. Speculation ran wild, most of it far more dramatic than the truth, though the underlying suspicion that something significant existed between their king and the mysterious stable healer proved impossible to fully deny. Nora, ever perceptive, cornered Elara on her first morning back among the wolves, arms crossed and expression unreadable. "The entire territory is speaking of nothing else," she said without preamble. "Our king, who has shown no serious interest in any potential match since taking the throne, personally carried an unconscious healer to the castle and refused to leave her side for 3 days. You understand what that looks like." "It was simply concern for someone who served the pack well during the crisis," Alara said, though even to her own ears the explanation sounded thin and unconvincing. Nora's expression softened slightly, sympathy replacing her usual sharp assessment. "Whatever is developing between you and the king, tread carefully. His position comes with expectations, alliances, and responsibilities that extend far beyond personal happiness. Not everyone within this pack, or beyond it, will welcome an outsider healer rising to such prominence, regardless of how deserved that rise might be." The warning settled uncomfortably in Alara's chest, a reminder that whatever tender feelings had grown between herself and Kane existed within a world far more complicated than the simple safety of the stable walls she had grown to love. But even as worry crept back into her thoughts, she found herself unable to regret a single moment of the closeness that had developed between them, unable to wish away feelings that had given her, for the first time in her entire life, a genuine sense of being seen, valued, and cherished exactly as she was. She threw herself back into her work with renewed dedication over the following weeks, and Kane, true to whatever unspoken promise had passed between them, made no attempt to hide his growing attachment to her, visiting the stables openly, walking with her through the training grounds during quiet afternoons, and gradually introducing her to trusted members of his inner circle, who had earned enough respect and loyalty to be told the truth about her circumstances. What neither of them yet realized was that not everyone within the wider region shared their growing happiness, and that powerful forces beyond their own territory had already begun taking notice of the unusual bond developing between their formidable Alpha King and the once nameless healer, who had wandered into his stables seeking nothing more than a place to survive the night. Autumn settled over the territory with cooling winds and shortening days, and with it came a decision from Kane that sent fresh waves of speculation rippling through the pack. He called a formal meeting of his council, the gathered advisors and senior pack members who guided important decisions affecting the territory's future, and announced his intention to appoint Alara as the official head of the pack's medical staff, a position of genuine authority and respect that would move her permanently from the stables into proper quarters befitting her new standing. The announcement met with mixed reactions. Nora, unsurprisingly, offered immediate and enthusiastic support, praising Alara's proven skill and dedication with the kind of genuine respect that carried weight among the more skeptical council members. Oliver, who had grown into a genuine friendship with Alara over their months working together, could not hide his pleased smile at seeing her finally receive proper recognition for her tireless work. But not everyone shared their enthusiasm. An older advisor named Gareth, whose family had served the pack's leadership for generations, voiced pointed concerns that others in the room clearly shared, but hesitated to speak aloud. "With respect, my king, elevating an outsider with unknown lineage to such a position of authority carries significant risk. We know nothing of her true origins, her family, or her intentions. Granting her this level of trust and visibility feels premature, regardless of her undeniable medical skill." Kane's expression hardened at the implied accusation buried within Gareth's careful words. "Her skill has saved dozens of lives within this pack, including during a crisis that could have devastated our fighting force entirely. That skill and dedication have earned her this position, regardless of questions surrounding her past. And her inability to shift?" Gareth pressed, revealing that whispers about Alara's condition had indeed reached even the highest levels of pack leadership. "Some among our people already question whether such a weakness reflects poorly on our territory's strength, particularly given the increasing prominence she has gained within your personal circle, my king." The room fell into tense silence at the directness of Gareth's challenge, several council members shifting uncomfortably as they waited for Kane's response. Alara, who had been asked to attend the meeting given the decision directly concerned her, felt heat rising in her cheeks, old shame threatening to resurface despite everything Kane had told her privately about her worth extending far beyond her physical limitations. But before humiliation could fully take hold, Kane rose from his seat, his presence commanding immediate attention throughout the chamber. "Strength is not measured solely by one's ability to shift," he said, his voice carrying the authority that had earned him unwavering loyalty throughout his years of leadership. It is measured by dedication, by skill, by the willingness to sacrifice one's own comfort for the well-being of others. Elara has demonstrated more genuine strength through her actions than many who possess the physical ability to shift, but lack the character to use their gifts meaningfully. He turned to address the entire gathered council directly. I will not apologize for recognizing exceptional merit regardless of its source. Elara's appointment stands, and I expect every member of this pack to extend her the respect her position and her demonstrated skill have rightfully earned. The finality in his tone left little room for further argument, though Elara could see lingering doubt on several faces throughout the chamber. Doubt that would not simply disappear because their king had declared the matter settled. She understood, with a familiar sinking feeling, that formal appointment would not automatically translate into genuine acceptance from everyone within the pack. That understanding proved accurate over the following weeks. While many pack members welcomed her new position with genuine warmth, having witnessed firsthand her dedication and skill, others treated her with barely concealed resentment, viewing her rapid rise as unearned favoritism rather than deserved recognition. Whispered comments about her inability to shift grew bolder, no longer confined to private conversations, but occasionally spoken within earshot, clearly intended for her to hear. Elara bore the cruelty with practiced resilience, having endured far worse throughout her life, but the accumulated weight of constant judgment began wearing at her confidence, despite Kane's consistent support and reassurance during their private moments together. Their relationship, meanwhile, had deepened considerably, beyond the careful boundaries either had initially intended. Stolen moments during quiet evenings, gentle touches that lingered longer than necessary, conversations that revealed increasingly personal truths about their hopes and fears, all had built toward an emotional intimacy neither could deny or resist any longer. It was during one such evening, walking together through the quiet gardens behind the castle, as autumn leaves drifted down around them, that Kane finally voiced what had been building between them for months. I have never felt this way about anyone before, he admitted, stopping their walk to face her directly, moonlight illuminating the sincerity plain across his features. You arrived in my territory as a stranger with nothing, and somehow you have become the person I think of first each morning, and last each night. I know the complications this creates, the risks to both of us given my position, and the resistance we have already faced. But I cannot continue pretending these feelings do not exist. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs, hope and fear tangling together, as they always seemed to, whenever her feelings for Kane threatened to overwhelm her careful defenses. I feel the same way, she whispered, finally allowing herself to voice the truth she had guarded so carefully for months. But I am frightened, Kane. Frightened of what it means for you to care for someone like me, someone the world has already told me is broken and unworthy. Frightened of what your pack, your council, your entire territory will think, if you choose someone like me, over the kind of match your position deserves. Kane closed the remaining distance between them, his hands coming up to gently cup her face, tilting her gaze up to meet his own with unmistakable tenderness. You are not broken, he said firmly. You are the strongest, most extraordinary person I have ever known. And my position exists to serve this pack well, which means choosing what and who genuinely strengthens us, not simply what tradition or expectation dictates. You strengthen me, Elara. You strengthen this entire pack through your work and your presence. That is worth more than any political alliance or traditional match ever could be. Before she could formulate any response to such an overwhelming declaration, Kane finally closed the last remaining distance between them, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that felt like every carefully guarded wall she had built around her heart finally crumbling into dust. She melted into the embrace without hesitation, months of denied feelings and careful restraint finally given permission to exist openly in the quiet privacy of the moonlit garden. When they finally parted, breathless and smiling in a way that transformed both their faces into something younger, freer than either had allowed themselves to be and longer than they could remember, Kane rested his forehead gently against hers. Whatever challenges come from this, he murmured, whatever resistance we face from those who cannot see your true worth, I promise you this. I do not intend to let you go, Elara. Not now, not ever. Neither of them could have known, in that perfect, hopeful moment beneath the autumn moon, exactly how quickly, and how severely that promise would soon be tested. The trouble arrived in the form of a formal delegation from the neighboring Ashwood territory, led by their Alpha's daughter, a striking and sharp-minded woman named Vivian, who had long been rumored throughout the region as a potential match for Cain, given the strategic advantages such an alliance would offer both territories. Her arrival, announced weeks in advance through official channels, threw the entire castle into a flurry of careful preparation, and Elara felt the familiar tightening of anxiety settle into her chest the moment she learned the purpose behind the visit. "It is purely a diplomatic gathering," Cain assured her the evening before Vivian's arrival, sensing her unease despite her attempts to hide it. "Ashwood territory has requested renewed trade agreements, nothing more. My feelings toward you remain unchanged, regardless of who visits our lands." Elara wanted desperately to believe him, and mostly she did, but old insecurities proved difficult to fully silence, especially when the alternative being suggested by whispered pack gossip was a woman of proper lineage, full shifting ability, and a political alliance that would strengthen both territories considerably. Vivian arrived with an entourage befitting her status, elegant and composed, in a way that immediately commanded attention throughout the castle grounds. She was, Elara noted with a sinking feeling in her stomach, exactly the kind of match everyone had always expected for a king of Cain's standing, beautiful and confident, with the kind of natural authority that came from generations of powerful bloodline. The formal dinner welcoming the Ashwood delegation proved excruciating for Elara, seated at a lower position along the extended table, while Vivian occupied the seat of honor directly beside Cain, engaging him in easy, practiced conversation that highlighted every advantage such a match would offer. Elara watched, feeling increasingly small and out of place despite her official position within the pack, as Vivian's laughter rang out at something Cain said, her hand resting briefly against his arm in a gesture of casual familiarity that made Elara's chest ache with an insecurity she desperately tried to suppress. Later that evening, walking alone through the castle corridors after the formal dinner had finally concluded, Elara found herself intercepted by Vivian herself, the Ashwood Alpha's daughter, clearly having sought her out deliberately. "You must be the healer everyone speaks of so frequently," Vivian said, her tone pleasant enough on the surface, though something calculating lurked beneath her polished smile. "The one who cannot shift, if the rumors traveling between territories prove accurate." Elara stiffened, old defensive instincts rising immediately. "I do not believe we have been properly introduced. No need for formalities between us," Vivian continued smoothly, ignoring the pointed deflection. "I simply find myself curious how someone with your particular limitations managed to secure such an unusual position of favor within King Cain's court. It is quite the remarkable rise for someone with no known family or pack history." The implication behind her words could not have been clearer, and Elara felt heat rising in her cheeks, despite her determination not to let this stranger's cruelty affect her. "I earned my position through my work," she said, keeping her voice steady, despite the tremor of anger and hurt threatening to break through. "Nothing more, nothing less." "Of course," Vivian said, her smile never wavering, even as her eyes remained sharp and assessing. "Though I imagine a king in Cain's position must eventually consider matches that offer genuine strength to his territory, rather than simply personal fondness. Alliances built on strategic strength have historically proven far more enduring than those built on fleeting sentiment, particularly when one party carries the kind of weakness your condition represents." Elara left the conversation feeling shaken in a way she had not experienced since her earliest days within Cain's territory. Old fears about her own unworthiness resurfacing with painful clarity. She did not mention the encounter to Cain that evening, uncertain how to voice fears that felt simultaneously irrational and terrifyingly plausible. Over the following days, as diplomatic negotiations continued between the two territories, Vivian's presence proved a constant source of quiet torment for Elara. The Ashwood Alpha's daughter seemed to appear wherever Elara happened to be working, offering pointed comments about tradition, strength, and the particular expectations placed upon a king's chosen mate, each remark delivered with enough plausible deniability that Elara had no way to properly address the cruelty without appearing paranoid or petty. Cain, absorbed in the genuine demands of diplomatic negotiations that would affect trade and border relations for years to come, remained largely unaware of the psychological campaign being waged against Alara during his necessary absences from her side. When they did find time together, exhausted from his diplomatic duties, Alara found herself unable to voice the doubts consuming her, unwilling to burden him with insecurities during such a critical diplomatic period. The breaking point arrived during a gathering held to formally conclude the trade negotiations, attended by nearly the entire pack alongside the Ashwood delegation. Vivian, perhaps sensing an opportunity too perfect to resist, orchestrated a public conversation designed specifically to expose the very vulnerability Alara had worked so desperately to keep hidden from wider knowledge. "I understand there has been some question," Vivian announced, her voice carrying just loud enough to draw attention from nearby guests, "about whether certain members of this pack possess the full range of wolf abilities one might expect. Surely, for a gathering celebrating strength and unity between our territories, it would be fitting for everyone present to demonstrate their heritage properly." The suggestion hung in the air, innocent enough on its surface, but Alara understood immediately, the trap being set specifically for her. Several nearby pack members, some of whom had never fully accepted her presence within their community, seized upon the suggestion eagerly, calling for a demonstration that would force the exact confession Alara had spent months desperately trying to avoid. "Come now," Vivian pressed, her eyes locking onto Alara with poorly disguised satisfaction. Surely the healer, who has risen to such prominence within this territory, would not object to a simple demonstration of pack unity. Alara felt the walls closing in around her. Dozens of eyes now turned expectantly in her direction, waiting for a demonstration she knew, with sickening certainty, she could not provide. Panic clawed at her throat, humiliation already burning hot across her skin, even before the inevitable truth became public knowledge. She had no wolf to show them. She never had. The silence stretched unbearably, as every gathered guest waited for Alara's response. Vivian's satisfied expression barely concealed as she watched her carefully orchestrated trap close around its intended target. Alara felt her throat tighten, old shame and terror rising with such force that for a moment she genuinely believed she might simply flee the gathering entirely, disappearing into the night the way she had fled her old pack months earlier. "I cannot shift," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly through the suddenly silent crowd. "I never have been able to." The reaction was immediate and exactly as devastating as she had always feared. Gasps rippled through the gathered crowd, some pack members exchanging knowing glances that confirmed rumors they had clearly already suspected, others staring at her with open disgust, or pity, that felt equally unbearable. Vivian's satisfaction bloomed into something almost triumphant, though she maintained enough composure to keep her expression carefully neutral for appearances. "How unfortunate," Vivian said, her tone dripping with false sympathy that fooled no one paying close attention. "Such a significant limitation for someone holding such an influential position within this territory. One does wonder how appropriate it truly is for a king's closest companion to carry such a fundamental weakness." Alara felt herself shrinking beneath the weight of dozens of judging stares, years of accumulated shame and rejection crashing over her with renewed force. She had known this moment might come eventually, had feared it every single day since arriving in Kane's territory, but knowing something might happen, and actually living through its arrival, proved to be entirely different experiences. "I should leave," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else, already beginning to turn away from the crowd that had witnessed her deepest shame laid bare before the entire gathering. "Stay exactly where you are." Kane's voice cut through the murmuring crowd like a blade, commanding and absolute in a way that immediately silenced every whispered conversation throughout the gathering hall. He had arrived just moments earlier, drawn by the unusual tension he sensed even from across the crowded room, and had witnessed enough of the exchange to understand precisely what had transpired in his brief absence. He moved through the parting crowd with deliberate purpose, coming to stand directly beside Alara, his presence a solid wall of protection against the judgment still radiating from every direction. When he turned to address the gathered pack, his expression carried an intensity that made even Vivian's confident composure falter slightly. "I have heard what was said here tonight," Kane announced, his voice carrying easily throughout the silent hall, "and I find myself deeply disappointed in the character of anyone who would orchestrate such cruelty, dressed up as innocent curiosity, against someone who has done nothing but serve this pack with extraordinary dedication and skill. He turned to face Vivian directly, his expression leaving no room for misinterpretation. Ashwood Territory's hospitality clearly does not extend to basic decency. I suggest your delegation reconsider the manner in which future diplomatic visits are conducted. Vivian's composure finally cracked slightly under the weight of Kane's obvious fury, though she attempted to maintain some semblance of dignity. I meant no true offense, my king. Simply an observation regarding appropriate standards for those holding positions of influence. The only inappropriate standard I see here, Kane replied coldly, is judging someone's worth based on physical ability, rather than character, skill, and genuine contribution. Alara has saved more lives within this pack through her dedication than most fighters manage through their strength alone. Her inability to shift does not diminish that truth in any way. He turned back to face the wider gathering, his voice rising with genuine conviction that carried clearly to every corner of the hall. I have watched this woman work herself past exhaustion, caring for our sick and wounded. I have watched her show more courage facing judgment and cruelty than many who consider themselves strong through physical ability alone. Whatever limitations her body carries mean nothing when weighed against the strength of her character and the depth of her dedication to this pack. Alara stood frozen beside him, tears now openly streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the public declaration of support she had never dared hope to receive, especially not in front of the entire gathered pack and a hostile foreign delegation. Kane turned to face her directly then, his expression softening from righteous fury into something achingly tender, seemingly oblivious to or simply unconcerned with the hundreds of watching eyes throughout the hall. Alara, he said, his voice carrying clearly, despite dropping in volume, intimate, in a way that made the surrounding crowd feel almost irrelevant. You have never been broken or cursed. You are the most extraordinary person I have ever known, and I do not care who witnesses me saying so. He reached for her hand, lifting it gently, to press a reverent kiss against her knuckles, a gesture of respect and affection, so genuine and unguarded that it silenced any remaining whispers of doubt among the watching crowd. I choose you, he said, loud enough now for the entire hall to hear clearly. Not despite your inability to shift, but alongside every other quality that makes you exactly who you are. I choose you as my equal, as someone who has earned every measure of respect this pack can offer, and as someone I intend to build my future alongside, regardless of what tradition or expectation might otherwise suggest. The hall remained silent for a long, suspended moment, before Nora, standing near the front of the gathered crowd, began to clap slowly, deliberately, the sound echoing through the tense silence, like a declaration of its own. Oliver joined moments later, followed gradually by other pack members who had witnessed firsthand the value of Alara's contributions over the previous months, until the hesitant applause grew into something resembling genuine acceptance from at least a significant portion of the gathered crowd. Vivian, recognizing the shifting tide of sentiment and the impossibility of salvaging her earlier scheme, offered a stiff, formal excuse before withdrawing from the gathering, with her remaining dignity barely intact, taking her diplomatic delegation with her far earlier than originally planned. Alara, overwhelmed by the events of the evening, could barely process the magnitude of what had just occurred, the public declaration Kane had made before his entire pack, the acceptance beginning to spread through even the most skeptical members of the community, who had previously questioned her worthiness. You did not have to do that, she whispered, still holding tightly to his hand, as the crowd slowly began dispersing around them, murmured conversations, now carrying tones of curiosity and admiration, rather than the cruel judgment from earlier. I did, Kane said simply, gently wiping the remaining tears from her cheeks with careful, tender movements. You have spent your entire life believing you needed to hide, to minimize yourself, to accept whatever cruelty others directed toward you. I refuse to let that continue, not while I have breath in my body and authority within this territory to ensure otherwise. She looked up at him then, seeing not just her king, not just the powerful alpha who commanded respect throughout the region, but the man who had chosen, repeatedly and without hesitation, to see her worth when the entire world had told her she possessed none. I love you, she said, the words slipping free before she had fully decided to speak them, though the moment they left her lips, she knew them to be nothing but absolute truth. Kane's expression transformed into something radiant, joy breaking through the protective intensity he had carried throughout the confrontation. "I love you as well," he said, "more than I ever believed myself capable of loving anyone, and I intend to spend considerable time proving exactly how much, starting with ensuring the entire world understands precisely how extraordinary you truly are." Word of that evening's events spread quickly, not just through Kane's own territory, but through the wider region as well, carried by members of the Ashwood delegation, who had witnessed the confrontation firsthand, and by traders and travelers who passed the story along with each retelling. Rather than damaging Kane's reputation as some had perhaps hoped, the story of an Alpha King publicly defending and choosing a healer others had dismissed for her physical limitations only enhanced the respect and admiration many held for him, painting a portrait of a leader whose strength included wisdom and genuine character, rather than simple physical dominance alone. Within the pack itself, the shift proved slower but genuine. Those who had harbored doubts about Alara's worthiness found those doubts increasingly difficult to maintain, as they witnessed, day after day, the continued dedication and skill she brought to her position, now performed with a confidence that had been sorely lacking during the months she spent hiding her true nature from public scrutiny. Freed from the burden of concealment, Alara seemed to flourish in ways that surprised even those who had known her throughout her time within the territory. Ivy, the young woman who had once whispered cruel judgments within Alara's earshot, approached her weeks later, with an awkward, genuine apology, admitting that watching Kane's public declaration had forced her to reconsider assumptions she had never truly examined before. Alara accepted the apology with the same grace she brought to everything else, understanding that genuine growth deserved acknowledgement rather than lingering resentment. Gareth, the advisor who had voiced the strongest initial resistance to Alara's appointment, gradually warmed toward her as well, impressed, despite his initial skepticism, by the continued evidence of her genuine value to the pack's well-being. Their relationship never grew particularly warm, but mutual respect eventually replaced the wary suspicion that had characterized their earliest interactions. As winter settled over the territory, Kane called another formal gathering of his council, though this time the purpose carried none of the tension that had characterized previous meetings concerning Alara's position within the pack. Instead, he announced his intention to formally claim Alara as his mate, an announcement that, while not entirely unexpected given the events of recent months, still sent waves of excitement rippling through the gathered pack members. The ceremony itself, held during the first proper snowfall of winter, brought together the entire pack in celebration, unlike anything Alara had ever witnessed or imagined possible for herself. She stood before the gathered community, dressed in garments that honored both traditional pack customs and her own personal history, feeling for the first time in her entire life, not merely tolerated or accepted, but genuinely celebrated for exactly who she was. Nora stood as her closest witness, having grown from a suspicious healer, conducting careful evaluation, into one of Alara's dearest friends throughout the months of their shared work. Oliver beamed with obvious pride from among the gathered crowd, having watched the entire journey unfold from that very first startled discovery of a stranger, sleeping among sick wolves, nearly a year earlier. As Kane spoke the traditional words binding them together as mates before the assembled pack, his voice carried the same quiet certainty that had first drawn Alara's attention months earlier, when he had knelt beside her in a stable full of sick wolves, offering assistance without judgment or expectation of anything in return. "I choose this woman," he declared, his voice ringing clear across the winter silence, "not for lineage or strategic advantage, but for the depth of her character, the extraordinary strength of her compassion, and the genuine joy she brings into every life she touches, wolf and human alike. I choose her as my equal partner in leading this pack forward, confident that her wisdom and dedication will strengthen us in ways that extend far beyond simple physical power." When Alara spoke her own vows in response, her voice steady and sure, in a way that would have seemed impossible to the frightened, exhausted young woman who had crossed into this territory with nothing but desperation driving her forward, she felt the full weight of how far she had traveled, not merely in physical distance, but in the journey toward finally believing in her own worth. "I choose this man," she said, meeting Kane's eyes with complete confidence, not for his power or position, but for the kindness he showed a stranger with nothing to offer, for his willingness to see worth where others saw only weakness, and for teaching me that true strength lies not in what we can become through shifting, but in who we choose to be through our actions and our hearts. As the ceremony concluded and the gathered pack erupted into genuine celebration, wolves howling their approval toward the winter sky, while pack members embraced and shared in the joyful atmosphere, Elara found herself standing beside Cain, near the very edge of the stables, where her entire journey within this territory had first begun. The sick wolves she had once tended in secret desperation now thrived under the care of an expanded medical staff she herself had helped establish and train. The pup whose survival had first drawn Cain's attention to her presence had grown into a strong, healthy young wolf who still greeted Elara with obvious affection whenever she visited the stables that continued to hold such significance in both their hearts. "Do you remember?" Cain murmured, drawing her close against his side as they watched the celebration continue around them. "That very first morning I found you here, sleeping among wolves everyone else had given up on." "I remember," Elara said softly, leaning into his warmth as snow continued falling gently around them. "I was so frightened that morning, certain you would have me thrown out the moment you discovered a stranger among your sick wolves. I remember thinking," Cain admitted, "that I had never seen anything quite so remarkable as someone who would give everything she had to help creatures the rest of the world had already written off as lost causes." Elara smiled up at him, her heart full in a way she had never believed possible for someone who had spent so many years convinced of her own fundamental brokenness. "Perhaps that is exactly why I understood those wolves so well," she said. "I knew what it felt like to be considered a lost cause myself." Cain pressed a gentle kiss against her temple, his expression holding nothing but complete adoration as he looked down at the woman who had transformed not just her own life through her journey into his territory, but had transformed his understanding of what genuine strength and worthiness truly meant. "You were never a lost cause," he said firmly. "You were simply waiting for someone to recognize the extraordinary person you had always been, hidden beneath years of cruelty that never should have been directed toward you in the first place." As the celebration continued around them, warm laughter and joyful howls carrying across the snow-covered grounds, Elara allowed herself finally, completely, to believe in the future stretching ahead of her, a future built not on the fear and rejection that had defined her past, but on genuine love, mutual respect, and the unshakable knowledge that she had found not just a mate, but a true partner who saw her exactly as she was, and considered that vision more than enough. The girl who had once slept among sick wolves, hiding from a world that told her she was cursed and unworthy, had become the queen her pack had never known it desperately needed, proving beyond any doubt that true worth had never depended on the ability to shift, but on the strength, compassion, and unwavering courage carried within one's own heart.